Russians are waging war against people, against the right to get water and food, to have security and dignity. They deny the fundamental human right to dignity. That is why they bomb populated areas, fire at civilian cars, engineer starvation, and destroy ports to supply food to those in need. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Catriona Murdoch, vice president at the Global Rights Compliance Foundation and an expert in the war crime of starvation and associated violations. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We really need your support now because our media is increasingly relying on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we help both soldiers and civilians, bringing mostly cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. So let's begin. Catriona Murdoch, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let us talk about the atrocities side of this war, because I think that many people perceive the Russian war against Ukraine as just a war of armies. And this is what we're trying to say all the time, that Russians are waging the war against civilians. They want to intimidate civilians. They want to punish civilians. And they do a lot of crimes which don't have actually the military purposes. How can you develop on that?
So I think, from the outset, this conflict is very different to many of the other conflicts that I have personally worked on, in that from the outset we are talking about a war of aggression, an unlawful invasion. And so within the realm of an already unlawful conduct, international humanitarian law, as many people know, that regulates the conduct of hostilities. So it regulates how wars are fought fairly and lawfully. What we see in the context of Ukraine, which, in many ways is similar to other conflicts that we've looked at, is that civilians are time and time again not only just caught in the crosshairs, but they are themselves being deliberately targeted. And I think in the context of Ukraine, the 3 years now into this conflict, at least this iteration of the conflict, we're seeing that civilians are the ones that are being targeted most specifically. And whether that is civilian infrastructure, whether it is civilians being tortured, or whether it is sexual violence, the range of atrocities and war crimes is vast.
Do you have any hope that all these crimes, some of these crimes, because the number of them is really huge, that some of these crimes will have justice in the international courts?
So I'm an optimist, and I think the wheels of international criminal law move very slowly. And I think the expectation of justice being something that should be swift and delivered quickly is not something that applies to international criminal law. Many of the appeals and trials that I have worked on in an international setting have lasted for years and years. Many of them have started decades after the war has already ended. So in the context of Ukraine, I think what is interesting is that we saw very quickly within the first year indictments and arrest warrants issued from the International Criminal Court. And I think that was the political will and the support for Ukraine, which now in recent events with new administration in the US is potentially changing. But certainly for the first 3 years of this war, the political will behind supporting Ukraine and supporting a just response to this war has been overwhelming. So for that reason, and for many other reasons, including the skill and amount of evidence that has been collected by Ukrainian prosecutors, Ukrainian civil society, working with international prosecutors and national, I think we can expect cases to come, and cases to come more quickly than in other contexts.
One of the war crimes that you are working on is the crimes related to food, related to starvation. And of course, for Ukrainians, it's a very painful topic because of our history, because of Holodomor, of Great Famine, of Stalinist regime, and previously Leninist regime, by the way, against the Ukrainian peasants. Why starvation is important here in this context?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I think is the start of many of our conversations here, particularly with prosecutors or investigators who are scratching their head a little bit. When you think about starvation, very often, and particularly, as you say, in countries where you have a history and a recent history of a mass famine event, there is a tendency to view this crime as only the deprivation of food or potentially water. But the crime itself, both under international humanitarian law and under international criminal law, is much broader. So it has within it the language of objects indispensable to survival. So essentially, the deprivation of anything indispensable is what is prohibited and what can be investigated and prosecuted. The reason why for Ukraine was, again, as I mentioned earlier, this crime has typically been overlooked in a range of different conflicts. And it's also been misunderstood as something that really is just associated with countries that have severe food insecurity. And it's been much more challenging in the context of Ukraine because, of course, we are not seeing famine. We're not seeing pockets of severe food insecurity like we saw in Syria or in South Sudan, for example, or Tigray in Ethiopia. But what we're seeing is very similar tactics. So, for example, in the context of Mariupol or in Chernihiv, where you besiege an area, you stop all form of food, water, medical supplies, humanitarian aid, and you prevent civilians from leaving those areas, then of course those deprivations and the impact and harm occurs. So again, it was trying to understand and articulate the harm that this can cause. And also because starvation, in many ways, the crime is described as a method of warfare. So a bit similar to genocide or a crime against humanity. It describes a broader pattern. So when we're looking at attacks on the ports in Odessa, or we're looking at the pillage of grain from swathes of Ukrainian countryside, or whether we're looking at attacks on hospitals, for example, all of these can be connected as part of this method of warfare, which, of course, going back to your first question, relates to civilians. They attacking the economic or agricultural way of life of a community has no military advantage. To deny an area from medical supplies or to attack a hospital, none of this has a military necessity, or very rarely would have any military necessity. So it's trying to capture and articulate individual incidents into something bigger.
So one of the stories that I've heard from the Ukrainian peasants is that Russians would encircle a certain village for several months and will impede any supplies of food. So the shops, the grocery shops, would be closed, and then Ukrainians survived this encirclement only thanks to the fact that Ukrainian families in villages usually they have storages of food. They have what we call zapasy or konservatsiya or something like that. But this is what I've heard from several persons. Do you see that, a typical story?
Inside of Ukraine?
Yes.
So a lot of our investigations have not been taking direct testimony from those that are impacted, other than in the context of Mariupol. So we have done a lot of open source and a sort of range of different data, open source information and intelligence that we have shared with the prosecutors and regional prosecuting officers. And they have collected that with the testimonies of those that are impacted. So the stories that we have heard of those types of scenarios have typically come secondhand to us. There are other organizations also working in taking that kind of statements. But I think it's a common trait that encirclement and that cutting off of supplies is certainly part and parcel of these tactics.
Let us talk about the cities that you mentioned, Chernihiv and Mariupol, because Chernihiv is also very known to me. I talked to people who were living there. Chernihiv, for our listeners, is an ancient medieval city in the northern part of Ukraine, and very close to Belarus and to Russia. And it was practically encircled, and the battle was kind of, Russians were on the one side, Ukrainians on the other side. And at a certain moment, people from Chernihiv told me that the only thing you could find in shops is shrimps, and there is nothing else, no food, nothing. And there were volunteers who were trying to supply this food, and tragically, many of them were killed, or some of them were killed. So, can you tell me more about those stories that you investigated?
So the first investigation that we did was actually in Chernihiv, and we used that as a pilot investigation to test some of our methodology, how we would work with the regional prosecuting office there, who have been an incredible partner, and also how we would work with our OSINT partners to really work together with different data sources. And we investigated a specific incident on the 16th of March where a bread queue was attacked. And as you say, as the shops were looted or the shops were cleared of any food and supplies.
16th of March 22, right? 2022.
Exactly, yeah. They, as you said, there were volunteers who would distribute, and it was very widely known and publicized on social media, different points around the city where you could go and collect bread. And there was a large bread queue waiting for people to come. And it was very visible from satellite imagery. You could see that this was not a military formation. It was women and some children and men queuing, waiting for this bread to be delivered. And there was a rocket that was fired into this queue, and many people were killed and severely injured. And so we wanted to explore whether there was any legitimate military targets in the area, what happened, who was responsible, and who could potentially be prosecuted. And so in the course of that, we understood and learned a lot more around the siege and what was being deprived and what was being attacked, how civilians were prevented from leaving, as you say, how humanitarian volunteers were attacked and targeted themselves. And we visited Chernihiv a number of times, and to the site as well of where the attack was, and you could still see the shrapnel in the road and at the wall of the shop. So I think it was a very it was a very difficult investigation. And one that as well the Truth Hounds, who we also work closely with, had done some really brilliant work on. But it was clear that it was very clear that the Russians knew that these lines, that these distribution points were being used by civilians to receive food, water. And again, we used that methodology in the context of Mariupol, where, again, very similarly, as soon as the shops were cleared, then distribution points were set up all around the city and informally communicated. There was posters that would go around to say, tomorrow, bread will be delivered here or made here. And again, those distribution points were attacked. And again, always within the context of international humanitarian law and these types of investigations, the process behind understanding whether that was lawful or unlawful is around, were there any legitimate targets nearby? Was the use of weapon something that was consistent with being able to be used in a targeted manner in an urban area like that? And it's this process of peeling back what has happened to understand again whether there's any potential legality to what happened. And in the case of Chernihiv, we found that there was some potential territorial army moving within the area, but the use of weapon was so disproportionate to the potential attack, and also in the context of the fact that so many civilians were there, and it was so publicly known that they would be there receiving food. For us, it was quite clear.
The question of bread is very, very interesting, whether I can use this word or not. Painful and intricate, because yes, bread disappears during the war because there are no supplies. Still, in Kherson, it's still today. Kherson is a very endangered city. It still supplies from Mykolaiv, from the neighboring big city. So it's quite difficult to bake bread. And in some of the deoccupied territories, I've met volunteers who are bringing bread to these people. And I remember talking to one of mayor of a village which was occupied, and basically his major. He stayed with his dwellers, although many of them have left. He stayed despite the occupation, and the major preoccupation that he had is to deliver bread. So bread is really something very, very, very important. Look, you mentioned Mariupol, and unfortunately, tragically, this is one of the most horrible places of Russian war crimes. We still don't know the whole history, because Russians occupied Mariupol and they just erased the memory of it. But tell me what you know, what you discovered.
So Mariupol was always going to be a big part of our work. We have a 2-year program that we're coming towards the end of, and it was going to be the key part of that investigation. So we really wanted to understand how that siege occurred, and what happened within it. And I think we were told very much from the beginning, from the usual partners that we would work with in these types of investigations, whether that's open source or other partners, that Mariupol was just going to be too difficult to investigate. It, as you say, it was almost erased. In terms of kind of forensic preservation of crimes, in terms of being access to witnesses, it was just going to be so difficult. And the intensity of that urban combat, and not really, where Ukrainian positions were, where Russian positions, how could you disentangle what happened there? Which I think for us as a team made it all the more important that we tried. And so what we looked at was, over the course of those 85 days, it was very clear to us what we were able to see in terms of the pattern of how systematically and step by step that siege became. So to begin with, I think we know now, I think with the benefit of time, that they thought Mariupol would be taken much quicker. And so initially they moved very quickly to cut off electricity, which in turn in Mariupol and in many parts of Ukraine, once you de-energize a city, it also cuts off their water supply because the water is pumped. And Mariupol has a specific kind of water which needs to be treated. It's a harsher water. So when the energy was switched or cut, it meant that the water supply was also immediately taken out. And then you also lost the ability to communicate, which was really important for the Russians to be able to spread misinformation, disinformation, confuse, terrorize, and keep people, where they were. So after they started to take out the critical infrastructure and then started to attack, food and distribution points, then the next phase became around preventing humanitarian corridors or preventing civilians from evacuating. And time again, we saw attempts at this, and then, ongoing Russian shelling, Russian attacks, which made it impossible for people to leave. Those that were able to leave, and it was what we described as a porous siege. So it wasn't like the sieges in Syria where it was completely sealed. There were certain periods, there was about 3 periods where large portions, thousands, were able to leave. But they had to pass through, obviously very, very dangerous circumstances. They also went through a filtration process, a Russification. And so it was a very, very dangerous, choice to leave, and one that certainly was unsuccessful for many civilians. Then we started to see after that, after the attacks on distribution centres and distribution points where food and civilians were sheltering, you started to see the attacks on the hospital and other areas, particularly as those were moved more around the city into wider shelters. So the drama theatre obviously was a big part of our investigation. Along with, there was a sports centre called the Neptune, where also a lot of people were sheltering and where was used as an evacuation point. The crimes that we looked at in the context of that siege were starvation, but also attacking civilian objects, attacking civilians, and then excessive incidental death and injury. There was such a range of ways in which Mariupol was destroyed and dismantled, from its water, its food, its healthcare, that it was a very, very compelling case of just the scale of Russian crimes.
So it's a really repeating pattern when the Russian army attacks crowds of people, the people who gather for something. So you mentioned this attack on Chernihiv on a line for bread. You mentioned drama theater in Mariupol and Neptune. We can also cite the case of the attack on railway station in Kramatorsk, where hundreds of people were waiting or thousands for evacuation train. We can cite an attack on shopping malls in Kremenchuk, in Kharkiv, in many other places. One of our friends, a famous Ukrainian writer, Victoria Melina, was killed when she was in a restaurant in Kramatorsk. Her book is, by the way, is now out in many languages, so I advise you to read Looking at Women, Looking at War. Do you understand why Russians are doing that? So why they directly attacking, not only just randomly, of course there are no military objects, but precisely those crowds of people, of civilians? What is the goal? Do you ask this question for yourself?
I mean, I think it's always difficult to, from a legal perspective, to get into the question of why.
Yeah, because I'm a philosopher.
Yeah,
I'm asking these questions.
No, and it's from a human perspective, it's the most important one, I think. Why, and how. From a legal question, in terms of intent, separating that from motive or desire is often something you're trained to do. But I think and it's difficult to speculate, but I think the repeated attacks on civilians, as you've, just a handful of examples that you've given there, I mean, there can be very few other suggestions other than to terrorize and to capitulate a nation. Why? Yeah, how else could you explain why that is so repeatedly occurring? And also with this, war, with this perpetrator, we're talking about the most sophisticated weapons, the most sophisticated ability to target, and a type of warfare that I think for generations we will learn from how this war was fought. So again, when you're looking at that level of sophistication and the arsenal that they have available to them, there can be very little suggestion of mistake or, slightly wrong targeting or collateral damage. We were pointing here, but, there was a pizzeria here. It becomes very difficult to argue any other way when you have that level of precision at your hands. So I think it has to be. It leads back. I mean, when we first started in 2022, a lot of the conversations we had with prosecutors and friends and colleagues here was around genocide. And I think from a legal perspective, genocide is so difficult to investigate and prosecute. And it felt almost a little bit premature to be talking in 2022 of, how can we say this so confidently at this stage? 3 years in, and the way that the way these attacks are taking place and the way that they are being targeted and the question of why, I think then you start to lead back to, is the desire here an eradication of a country and its people? Is this the question that we should now and should have been, and you were right, colleagues were right to ask 3 years ago. But it's...
Well, for Ukrainians, it certainly is, because we know our history and we are now trying to explain it. It's a repeated genocide. But I think you're right in saying that, striking the crowds of people is the way to intimidate. And I refer our listeners to our very recent conversation with Raji Abdul Salam from the Reckoning Project, when he told me that, look, I mean, he has this feeling that, well, what is the difference, for example, in torturing people? Sometimes you torture people in different circumstances, different episodes in history to get information. But in these cases, both in Syria and in Ukraine, we see that torture is not a way to get information, but a way to show who is the boss. So to impose very, very cruel power structures and to say, you are my slave and you should how to say it? You should submit. Yeah, you should obey. Do you think so?
I think so, and I think because there are so many different atrocity crimes occurring in Ukraine and replicated time and time again across different areas at different scales, then this question of it becomes very, very difficult to understand what kind of lawful rationale there could be for this. And I mean, the Reckoning Project, we work with them on a propaganda program, and they're fantastic group. And I think that this is about power. We know it's about power, and it's this taunting of that power, I think, that is so insidious in so many different levels of Ukrainian life. I think when you think of agriculture, for example, and it's often, when you have such a range of violent crimes as well, you sort of think, well, why would you be focusing on civilian infrastructure, or why would you focus on grain and agriculture when there's so many other, the hierarchy of crimes? But it's this dismantling of a way of life. It's your livelihood. It's your community. It's your ability to rebuild when this is over and to trade again and to have a position internationally. And it's the fear, especially as you say with the very recent history of the Volodymyr. It's these insidious power plays that I think sometimes are overlooked in the context of violent crime after violent crime. Yeah.
Tell me about this infrastructure topic, because we are asking why. You mentioned already why they would attack ports in Odessa and in other cities. So, of course, to harm the Ukrainian economy, but Ukrainian economy is exporting food worldwide, and it's making other people starve in Africa, in Asia. The same with targeting electricity grids, right? So we understand that electricity is everything in our life. It's not just watching movies. It's making surgeries, for example, or it's making food. It's heating. It's everything. Or you mentioned the Mariupol example, the example of water that we consume. Do you consider this attack on infrastructures is also a pattern? I think you beautifully formulated it, like destruction of the way of living.
I think that's right, because this is for me. I'm very interested in conflicts or aspects of conflicts where there are underreported or hidden crimes, or under-prosecuted. And critical infrastructure is one that, sometimes you can, when I discuss it at home in England, sometimes it can be overlooked. It's this, it's energy, switch it back on, repair it, it's an inconvenience rather than anything else. But as you say, when you come to rely on this for your surgeries, for your water, for your ability to hear your air alerts, when that's dismantled and you don't know whether you're supposed to be taking shelter or not taking shelter, to, all aspects of life, again, it becomes this submission. It's this power play of rendering civilians weak and an inability to carry on as if they were with the dignity and the prowess that Ukrainians were in so many different fields. And so I think with this critical infrastructure, the way that it is defined under Ukrainian law is infrastructure that is vital to Ukrainian life. So it's vital to its national interests. And of course, as you say, you can look at that in the context of the economy or industry, but it's much more than that. When your lift is unable to be operating and you're an elderly person in a high-rise flat and you can't come downstairs to reach shelter or reach food, these are the types that I think are the types of crimes that, don't get as much attention. So again, when you dismantle that type of critical infrastructure, and in the way that we're talking here in many ways, the scale of rebuilding and reconstruction that will be required for Ukraine is vast. So it is something that really it weakens the morale and it distracts those that are trying to respond, to all of these different crimes, and strips them of their ability to respond as quickly and as efficiently as possible because they can't access their case files or they can't access their, many, many different things. So it's a really interesting aspect, I think, of this conflict.
I can tell you two stories about electricity. One of them is, you probably remember the accident of a helicopter in which a Ukrainian interior minister died, Denis Monastyrsky. And I haven't heard any kind of investigation out of, maybe there is, I just didn't pay attention, but my impression that it was really an accident. Why? I because I was almost there. It happened in Brovary, and I'm living in Brovary. It's a suburb of Kiev, and the helicopter fell on the kindergarten, which is just next to our kindergarten. So to which we bring our children. We will bring our children at the time, and I think it's just a few hundred meters. And if you remember, there were young mothers who died. There were, I think, some kids who died or suffered. So why helicopter fell? One of the reasons, and I can at least confirm that it was a electricity cut because it was 22 or 23, and it was a huge fog, like incredible fog, and probably the helicopter was flying very low because we're very close to Belarus, and they can be down by a missile. But you know that in when you have electricity, you have lights on buildings, including on the roofs, and even during the fog, these lights help you orient. And maybe because of the absence of these lights and huge fog, the driver, the pilot, just didn't notice that he is actually flying over the next to the big buildings. Maybe this is one of the hypotheses. Another story is that to some of the villages that we visited that lacked electricity, people literally depend on water because they're using pumps to get water. They don't have a centralized water supplies, and for months they were using water that they melt out of snow, or they collect the water in from the rain. So it's indeed very, very important things.
We had the same stories in Mariupol with the snow, but also towards the end they were also, I'm sure you read about it, were bleeding the radiators. So they were taking the water from the radiators to try and drink that. But I think when you can read that language in the Ukrainian law of being vital to national interest, but critical infrastructure, it's the fabric of how you live and live with dignity. And I think that's another reason why this particular crime is of so much interest to us, because it's a dignity crime. It removes people from an ability to live normally, and it's that long-term impact that has on a society, beyond when peace comes and Ukraine is victorious. It's, this is something that for generations will have an impact. And there's a shame around having to drink water from the snow. There's a shame around having to steal from a supermarket because the one that you normally go to, there's nobody there now. There's a shame around being forced into a shelter night after night after night. And it's that indignity that there's a misunderstanding, I think, with this type of crime that, as you were mentioning before about bread and how important it is to Ukrainians and to your society. But there's this often an assumption that, well, you're in a conflict, people run out of food, it's inevitable. It's part and parcel of what happens in conflict, that you have these shortages. But what we see is that this is deliberate. This is not inevitable in many ways. This is not something that just happens. It's something that is done to people. And that indignity is, similar to sexual violence, where victims will often, take it upon themselves or blame themselves and think it was their fault. It's the same with this type of crime, where there's a shame around it that I think needs to be challenged.
Thank you for raising this. I think this is very important, this humane element, this element of dignity. Maybe my last question, about accountability. We touched upon it a little bit, and you mentioned the problems of certain slow pace of international justice, and that's true. But there is another challenge: is that we see this political environment. I will not ask you about politics, but just to give a context that there is a risk of normalization of Russia. Trump is going to meet Putin maybe, and they're already meeting and negotiating. And we have been talking for such a long time about accountability and about responsibility and about justice. Do you have a fear that in a situation when political environment will change, and when you have the United States who is imposing sanctions on the International Criminal Court and just disregards the international law, do you have a fear that everything will be kind of delayed infinitely or even suspended?
I think we have to plan for all eventualities and be really creative now about what that might look like. I am fearful. I think these are fearful times. Every day you wake up and you're not quite sure what is going to be the situation. But I think what can happen, and as we saw with the likes of, Syria on the 8th of December, these things can change very, very quickly. And that is why it's really important now to understand for Ukrainians and for Ukrainians to lead this discussion, what are the red lines? What will we not agree upon? Indefinite suspensions or amnesties for peace. The amount of evidence that has already been collected, the advancing case files, notices of suspicions, indictments that are happening nationally, there can be no last sustainable peace without justice, in my view. And we've seen that time and time again across other conflicts. I met with Yuri Belousov today, who's the head of the War Crimes Unit for the Prosecutor General's Office, and I was asking him similar questions about peace process and accountability, and how integral accountability has to be to that. And he said that no one has the right to forgive on behalf of victims and survivors for these crimes. That's not in anybody else's gift, I don't think. So really this full spectrum of transitional justice options, from redress, truth-telling, that really needs to be beyond accountability. Recognition and truth-telling for what has happened and is happening here has to be front and center.
Because it's not only about the past. My argument has always been that, look, Putinism is not just evil that is here. It's a result of unpunished evil. It's a result of repetitive evil. It's a result of the fact that he's part of the class that were murderers in the 20th century, because he's part of this KGB and KVD class who were murderers, who were changing the relation between the victim and the murderer, and saying that the victim is the murderer and the murderer is the victim, and etc. And if there is no justice now, then we should expect the wars in the future. But let me ask the final question. What gives you hope today?
In the context of Ukraine?
Yes.
I think the resilience of your people. I think this is the spirit that not only has not been diminished over 3 years, but has only grown. The courage and humor and optimism and creativity. I think that it humbles me and gives me huge source of hope. And I think with that, it's very difficult to overcome.
Thank you. Catriona Murdoch, thank you so much for this very interesting, deep and humane conversation.
Thank you. Thanks.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Catriona Murdoch, vice president at the Global Rights Compliance Foundation and an expert in the war crime of starvation and associated violations. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We really need your support now because our media is increasingly relying on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we help both soldiers and civilians, bringing mostly cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.